Have you ever felt like your sin is just too great, or maybe you've sinned too many times for God to forgive you or for you to be worth forgiving? David was called a man after God's own heart, and he broke three of the 10 commandments just in one setting. And so today we're going to learn all about David's sin, and hopefully it makes you feel a little bit better about yourself. And this is going to be like a 2 or 3 part episode because there's a lot of things that we can learn from David and about God and about ourselves in this one story. And so today we're going to talk about everything that David did and his consequences, and we're going to end by seeing how he dealt with the consequences that God gave to him. And then next week, and maybe in the following week, we're going to talk about how God does restore his situation. And so it doesn't end with the consequences. And then also how David covered up his sin and what he should have done instead. And so, if you remember last week, we talked about a battle that started with the Ammonites and ended with the people in Syria. And remember, when they went to battle with the Ammonites had gathered the Syrians to come and help them. And when the Syrians ran away, the Ammonites also ran away. But David didn't forget about them because remember, the king had mocked his servants when he sent them there to pay respects for his dad after his death. And David has not forgotten about this. He just went back home and waited until the weather got better. And so this chapter 11 begins by saying that in the spring of that year, in the time when the kings go out to battle, David sent Joab to go to the capital of the Ammonites and fight with them. But even though this is the time that the kings go out to battle, David doesn't go out to battle. He stays home. And this turns out to be a great disaster because all of the able bodied men are out fighting, and obviously their wives and children are left at home, and David is left at home with their wives. And so one day he's out on his roof walking around. They had flat roofs, and he saw this woman bathing either on her own roof or in the courtyard of her home. And so this would have been a private place that no one else would have been able to see except for the king, because his high position as king also gave him a high position in his home, where his house was the tallest of all, so that he could overlook the kingdom. And this gave him access to see this woman who was bathing on the roof. And apparently she was very beautiful and he was attracted to her. So he started asking around, who is this lady? And they told him that her name was Bathsheba, but it's actually significant who she belonged to, because her father Eliam and her husband Uriah were both soldiers in his army, and not only soldiers, but some of his mighty men that, if you remember, we talked about several of the men that David named as his mighty men a few chapters ago. And so these men are out fighting honorably for him, and he is being tempted by either the wife or the daughter of one of these two men. And it says that he called Bathsheba to him and he slept with her. And then soon after, she notifies him and says, I'm pregnant. And we find out that when he saw her bathing, she was purifying herself from her monthly period. So we know that the baby does not belong to her husband Uriah, because she wasn't pregnant until after she had slept with David. And so not only has David slept with one of his mighty men's wives and another of his mighty men's daughter, but now it looks like he's gotten caught. And so what is he to do? Well, he decides that he'll just call Uriah to him. And if he can get Uriah to sleep with his wife while he's there, then everybody will think that the baby belongs to him and no worries. And so when Uriah comes to him, he plays it off at first like he was just trying to find out how the war was going and everything. And then once he gets all that information, he says, well, while you're here, why don't you just go home and get cleaned up and have a nice dinner with your wife? And he sends some food to Uriah's house so that they can have a nice dinner and presumably he'll sleep with her. Well, Uriah doesn't go home because he feels guilty for going home when all the rest of the soldiers can't go home. And so he goes and spends the night with David's servants. And when David hears about this, he's like, you've got to be kidding me. And so he calls Uriah to him and he says, hey, why didn't you take me up on my offer to go home and be with your wife? And he said, well, I can't do that. You know, the soldiers and even the Ark of God are staying in temporary tents and can't go home to their wives. And so why would I do something like that? That seems like a betrayal. I can't do that. And David's like, well, okay, why don't you just stay here the night and you can eat a feast with me and then you can go home in the morning. So David has shifted his plan now and he thinks maybe I can just get him drunk and then when he leaves my house, he'll let go of his inhibitions and he'll go home and sleep with his wife. Well, that doesn't work either. He does not count on Uriah being such an honorable man. And he goes again and stays the night with David's servants. And so at this point, David doesn't know what to do about it. And so he says, I think I'm just going to have to kill him. I'll just let him die in the battle. You know, soldiers die in battles anyway. And so who's to say that he wasn't going to die in the battle anyway? But I'll just ensure this. And then that way, I'm not found out. But to add injury to insult, he sends the note to his commander, Joab, by way of Uriah himself. And the note says that David wants Joab to put Uriah on the front lines and then withdraw all the rest of the troops away from him so that he dies in battle. So Joab sets Uriah up against who he thinks will be the most valiant fighters on the Ammonite side, and Uriah does die. And so when Joab sends the messenger to tell David everything that happens, he says, I know he's going to be upset that I went to all the way up to the wall of the city because there was a man who got killed. If y'all remember, we talked about this in Judges, that got killed by a woman when he went all the way up to the gate of the city in battle, and the woman dropped a stone on his head and killed him. And he has become this cautionary tale. And so everybody's supposed to know not to go that close to the wall. And so Joab had done this, and he said, I know that David is going to ask, why in the world would you do that? You should know better. And so when he asked that question, make sure that he knows, yes, quite a few men did die because of this, but so did Uriah. That way, David is not upset that some of the men have died because he made this military move. And so when the messenger goes to David, he says, I just want to give you an update on the battle. We were getting beat in the fields, but we were able to push the Ammonites back into the city, and we pressed all the way up to the walls of the city, and several men died, and Uriah was one of them. And David says, tell Joab not to be upset about this matter. Men die in war. Sometimes it's their guys, sometimes it's our guys. Take courage, keep fighting, you'll prevail. I feel sure of it. Now, we're not sure because, David isn't letting the messenger know exactly what he is trying to convey to Joab. So we're not sure if he is telling Joab, don't be upset that we just killed Uriah, or if he is actually saying what he seems to be saying, which is, that's just part of war. People die and just keep pressing forward. Now, also notice that Job didn't do this exactly like David told him to do, because he didn't put him on the front lines and then withdraw troops from him, because frankly, I can't believe that David was so blatant with Joab in telling him that he wanted Uriah to die. You know, he could have just sent this note to Joab and said, I talked with Uriah and I'm so convinced that he's such a valiant warrior. You should put him up against all of their best fighters. And he probably would have died anyway. You know, he wouldn't have had to even tell Joab, much less to tell the rest of the soldiers. If Joab tells some of the other soldiers to move away from Uriah, don't you think that's going to be pretty obvious that he or David or both are trying to get him killed? That seems ridiculous. And so Joab just puts him up against the rest of the fighters. Maybe he wouldn't have even gone all the way up to the wall if not for trying to get Uriah killed. And so maybe that's what he's telling David, is like, I know that I'm not supposed to do this, but it seemed like the best plan to get Uriah killed. And some other guys did die in the process, though. And David's like, yeah, I get it. That's just what you needed to do in order for Uriah to die. And so people die in war, and, you know, normally that's not the greatest military move, but it's what we needed to do. And so that's fine. I don't really know exactly what he was trying to convey, but he was encouraging Joab, keep moving forward. And then after Bathsheba found out that Uriah was dead, it says that they gave her the normal time to mourn, and then David took her in as his wife. See, this is the plan all along, because now he can just marry her, and then it looks like she just got pregnant immediately, and nobody knows that she got pregnant, you know, before David and her got married. And so he takes her in, and it looks as though he's gotten away with it, right? He got away not only with sleeping with her, but he also got away with killing Uriah, and nobody knows anything else. But the chapter 11 ends by saying God was not pleased, though. So he may have hidden it from all the people, but he did not hide it from God. And God sent Nathan with a message to David. But Nathan doesn't just start out by rebuking David. Instead, he tells David this story about two herdsmen. One was rich and one was very poor. And the rich man had a lot of flock, but the poor man only had one little ewe lamb. And he said he treated it like it was, you know, his own child. Says he played with his own kids played with it. It ate from his table, drank from his cup, and laid in his lap. And he just loved this little lamb. Well, one day a traveler came to visit the rich man, and instead of taking one of his own flock, he took that poor man's little lamb and butchered it and had it for dinner with the traveler that had come to visit him. And when he told David this story, David was so outraged, and he said, that man deserves to die. And not only that, but he should pay him back fourfold for his one little lamb, because he had no pity on him. And the reason, obviously, that Nathan told him this story is because he wanted David's unbiased opinion about what should happen to a person when they have everything, yet they take the one thing that that other person has that only belongs to them, right? And if we're honest, sometimes we may not want revenge on someone else, but we always do kind of like it whenever they can understand what it feels like to have the same type of thing happen to them. And that's what Nathan is doing. And David says the reason that he's giving this punishment to this rich man is because he's not understanding what the poor man feels. And so then David says, well, you're the rich man in the story. You're the one that wasn't thinking about how Uriah felt. You're the one who has everything. God gave you Saul's kingdom, and you have access to all of his women. You have access to all the virgins of the land, and you even have your own wives. Yet instead of satisfying your own desires with them, you took the only wife that Uriah had while he's out giving his life to you, fighting for you. And you took his wife, the only thing that is forbidden from you, and you used her to satisfy your own hunger when you had your own wives and all the rest of the virgins that you could have chosen from. And so, because of your high position, the position that God gave to you, you were in the position to sleep with Uriah's wife, and you were able to kill him. So you were able to send him away. And because he was fighting on your behalf, fighting on your behalf, you were able to sleep with his wife. And then because of your high position, you were able to kill him. So he paid for your crime. All of this because God gave you the position of king, because you had advantage in order to do that. So you're the rich man in this scenario. In Exodus 22:1, it says that if a man ever takes another man's lamb and slaughters it, then he's supposed to pay the man back fourfold. And so the fourfold punishment was supposed to be for the animal, but not the death penalty. The person that actually was supposed to receive the death penalty was David, because the death penalty was for taking another man's wife and using her to satisfy your own desires, or for killing someone. And David had done both of those things. And so Nathan says, you had blatant disregard for God's laws. You gave a harsher punishment to the rich man than what he deserved, while simultaneously trying to escape the punishment that you deserved. And so you have no regard for God's laws. But even though you deserve the death penalty for both of your crimes, God, in his mercy, this is the message that God gave to Nathan to give to David, says that even though you deserve the death penalty because you stole this man's wife, I'm going to give you the lesser penalty as if you would have stolen an animal, as if you were the rich man. And I'll give you the proper punishment that the rich man should have deserved, and not the harsh one that you were going to give to him. And instead, you will receive a fourfold punishment. And then God said, and I'll forego the murder charge altogether. So David does not receive the death penalty, but he receives a fourfold punishment. And then Nathan tells him what that's going to be. And he says, because you sent Uriah to die by the hand of the Ammonites, the sword will never leave your house. So basically, you're going to always be fighting. And not only will you be fighting people from without, but I'm going to raise up evil in your own house against you. And so that's the second punishment. The third punishment is, because you took Uriah's wife, I'm going to allow other people to take your wives and sleep with them, but it's not going to be private like you did to Uriah. I'm going to let them do that to you publicly. And at this, David says, you are so right. I sinned against God. I'm so sorry. And Nathan responded by saying, okay, well, there's one more punishment. And though you won't die for your sins, you're not going to profit from them either. And so this boy that Bathsheba is pregnant with is not going to live. So death does not escape his house completely. The death that he gave to Uriah does visit his house. And then after Nathan told him all of this, he left. And immediately the boy that Bathsheba had given birth to was found to be sick. And it must have happened, all of this must have happened as soon as Bathsheba gave birth, because the boy isn't even old enough to give a name to. And they usually received a name within the after the first week, whenever they were circumcised. And so this little boy is sick, and it says that David fasted and laid by his bed day and night and was sorrowful and begging God to save this little boy's life. And whenever his servants went to him and said he needed to eat, he said, I'm not eating. I want God to see that I am remorseful for the things that I've done, and maybe he will save my son's life. And so he stayed in the boy's room and cried and pleaded with God to save him. But after 7 days, even with all of his pleading, the little boy died. But the servants were scared to tell David, because they were like, if he acted like this and wouldn't eat anything or leave this boy's room just at the prospect of the little boy dying, what's he going to do when he finds out that he's actually died? But David saw them all whispering, and he deduced that the little boy was dead. And whenever he asked them, they said, yes, he has died. And to their surprise, instead of, going into some deeper depression, it says he got up off the floor, went and cleaned himself, changed his clothes, ate a meal, and worshiped God. And all of the people are like, why, when the boy was alive, were you, crying and fasting? And now that you found out that the boy is dead, you're eating a meal and, worshiping God and praising God. And David said, well, the reason is because I was trying to show God that I was sorry, and I was begging him for mercy on the little boy's life, because there was hope that he still might not die. Even though God had told me that this was going to happen, I thought that maybe he would change his mind. And so I kept praying and asking. But now it's evident that he's not going to save his life because he's dead. And so there's no point in me sacrificing or being sorrowful anymore. The boy's not going to ever join me in life. I may join him in death, but he's never joining me in life. So there's no purpose in my sacrifice and sorrow. And then in the meantime, Joab and his army are still fighting. And Joab eventually sends word to him and says, hey, I've taken control of the waterways. You need to come and take control of the city. Because if Joab were to take control of the city, then by the rules of that time, the city would have been named after Joab. And Joab wasn't fighting on behalf of himself to gain the city for himself. And so he says, David, you need to come and gain the city for Israel. And I've got control of it, basically, because I've got control of the water. So I need you to just come and take it. And so David does this, comes and takes the city. And then it says that he picks up the king's crown that weighs 75 pounds and has a precious jewel on it. And he puts this crown on his head. And then he takes many spoils. And according to the laws of the places that they go to battle with that are outside the bounds of Israel, they put them under servitude. And so it says that the people made bricks and weapons and things for the Israelites. And then David and the army went home. And next week, like I said, we're going to talk about how God does restore David, so it doesn't end with this punishment. And then we're either next week or the week after going to talk about how David should not have been covering up his sin. Instead of just, admitting what he did when he committed adultery with Bathsheba, he then killed Uriah and even probably got all these other men killed. They wouldn't have died if not for that. And so we'll talk about that next week.